Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. This video is designed to explain a little bit about the way in which we use Confluence in Telmar and also Jira. Originally I was asked to put something together which explains and gives a walkthrough for Confluence and Jira, but I always find I can't escape talking about Agile when I talk about Confluence and Jira, because there's so much in these tools concerning not just the buttons to press to do certain things, but the way in which we use the tools, particularly Jira. So I'll briefly start off talking about Agile, and particularly some key concepts: Scrum, product backlog, sprint backlog, and burn down. And then you'll see how all these fit together with Jira and Confluence. I've also put together some further reading. So anybody watching this video, if you'd like to understand more about Agile, which I seriously encourage since we're moving to become an Agile organization, not just in software development, but in other departments as well. This first article on Harvard Business Review is really an excellent place to start. It particularly talks about embracing Agile in the wider organization. So that is a great piece of reading. This other one also, McKinsey article, also very, very good for background on Agile as it pertains to an organization and not just to software development. And in fact, one of the key points that both of these articles raise is that often people will bandy around the words Agile and Scrum, especially people outside of software development, and they know, let's say, just enough to be dangerous. One of the most cited reasons for Agile failing in an organization is people don't get trained. So, I think we should really think about getting our C-suite and senior managers trained in Agile. There are a number of courses, online learning, which require individuals to go and spend the time themselves. In my experience, that works for people where it's an absolute imperative for them to learn Agile to do their jobs, where they're being driven by somebody else. But for others, I found the day-to-day avalanche of work tends to get in the way of them going and doing that self-exploration. So we might want to explore getting somebody to actually train us over the course of maybe a couple of 2 or 3 hour sessions. Without further ado, let's get into this session. Oh, with one more thing to mention: if you're really, really interested in Agile and where it started, this third link that I have here is the original Agile manifesto. So this is certainly directed at software development, but and certainly not directed at non-software development, other parts of the business, but still nonetheless might be useful to understand the foundations of where Agile comes from and the principles behind it. So I said I would talk a bit about Agile before I get into Confluence and Jira, and let's think the best way to get into that. Yeah, so I can tell you what Confluence is, I can tell you what Agile is, but let's understand some of the principles of why we use these tools. So Agile, and now I'll focus on software development. Agile principles center around a couple of artifacts, and perhaps the central artifact is called the product backlog. So I'll draw the idea of a product backlog here. So a product backlog is really just a list of everything that we want to do or develop. So in software, it's going to be all of the requirements that we have listed out. Now, they get written in a certain way, but that's a topic of another discussion entirely. But it's just a list, and it's a prioritized list. So the key here is prioritized. It's everything we want to do that we know about. Might be new feature developments, might be change requests, might be bugs, might be research projects or design spikes, just anything that we want to do that's going to use our resource. And the principle here is it is a prioritized list. Now, the reality of that is the stuff that's high priority is going to be at the top of the list, and the stuff that's lower priority will be at the bottom. And that tends to mean there's a lot more precision at the top of the list than there is at the bottom. Because if you've got a list of 2 or 3 or 400 projects or items here, you're really not going to spend a lot of time going into a great deal of detail on these items at the bottom of the list. But the items at the top, almost certainly, they'll be much more well-formed. So think of it like a graduation where the top is very clear priorities, fair amount of detail, well understood. And as you go down that list, the stuff at the bottom, it's agile. We're not going to waste our time putting a lot of attention into speccing and understanding this item at the bottom of the list, or even these items down here, because the fact is we're not going to be addressing those in the next short cycle, in the next sprint. The fact is that by the time we get to those, the whole requirement might have changed. So we're just not going to waste our time working a great deal on those. That would be something we might do in waterfall, where we would have the whole list of 200 features and we would try to spec every single thing in detail before we even start development, that old waterfall method. The problem with that in such a fast moving business these days is business does not stay static for long enough for us to get through that discovery process, business analysis, specification. It just doesn't work that way. Fast iterative cycles, that is agile. So how do we go from this backlog? So this is backlog. How do we go from the backlog into work that we're actually going to do? And this is where it starts to feed into Jira and Confluence. Well, if this is the product backlog, what we do in discussion, with the people that are actually going to do the work, so small agile team, knowing that this list is prioritized, we do sprint planning. So we'll start to work our way down this list and we'll say, well, in the next cycle, how much of this list can we do? So we might decide that we can do everything above this line in the next sprint, or the next, let's say it's a 2-week sprint. Might be 3, might be 1. Optimal tends to be about 2, because there's a certain amount of administration that goes into planning for a sprint, starting a sprint, and then closing a sprint. We don't want to be doing too much admin. If we did 2-day sprints, we'd just as soon as finish planning as we're ready to stop the sprint. So 2 weeks feels about right. But the key is this list at the top becomes what we call the sprint backlog. So now the backlog as a whole becomes 2 things. We have sprint backlog, and then everything else we just call product backlog. So a couple of key terms here: backlog, sprint backlog, product backlog. And then what we do with this sprint backlog, so we call these items stories, whether they're bugs or new development or change requests, those then go over here and they go onto what we call the board. And the board is the sprint board. And I will ask you to literally imagine a whiteboard on the wall, and this is the way it would have used to have been done. A whiteboard on the wall, in its simplest form, will have 3 columns, and those columns will be to do, in progress, and done. Now again, this workflow can be adjusted, and some teams, many teams actually, will have more stages than this. The trick is to pitch it about right. It's enticing to start to get very, very granular at this stage. So we'll have to do, we'll have ready, we'll have on hold, we'll have in progress, we'll have in review, we'll have testing, we'll have ready to deploy, we'll have done. Perfect in theory. And many teams will start with a simple board like this, to do, in progress, and done. And then they'll rapidly inflate this to a very, very granular board. And then they'll find they're doing just too much admin. So then they tend to sort of suck back into something a bit more smaller and optimized. But for simplicity's sake, let's stick with to do, in progress, and done. So what happens with all these stories that we put into the sprint backlog when we were planning? Well, as I said, we're going to move them onto the board. So they are going to go here onto the first column. So now we've got our stories. And why am I telling you all this? It's because when we look at Jira, we're going to see this in practice. Well, let's make this a little bit nicer. Here we go. When we go to look at Jira, we're going to see this in practice. We're going to see this in practice. We're going to see this in practice. So right now, I'm just sort of setting some basis of understanding. So at the start of the sprint, these 1, 2, 3, 4 stories, 4 or more, appear in our to-do column, our first column over here. And then as we move through the sprint, these will get picked up and moved So let's say we pick up this first story and it's going to go into in progress. And let's say another engineer talking again about software here picks up the second story and that's going to go into progress. So the principle is that stories move from column to column until ultimately, in theory, at the end of a sprint, all our stories are done. And then we repeat the process. The process now becomes, well, all these are done. So everything else that's on this list moves up and we repeat the process and start again. And that's basically is the Agile sprint cycle. So that's Agile Scrum. There are other flavors of Agile, but this is Scrum, where we have the 2-week cycles. So pause for breath. Let's see where we're at. Yeah, that's useful principles. Now, where Jira will come into this, you'll see how Jira as a product management and a software management tool is going to handle these artifacts for us. So sprint backlog, product backlog, backlog as a whole, and the board. Here we go, board. So it's going to handle these for us, and it's going to allow us to operate this workflow of what we call backlog grooming, it's the prioritization, sprint planning, starting the sprint, and then various other steps in there. Right. So let's draw Jira on here. So Jira is going to be our tool that we use to manage backlog and the active sprint board. Now, there's a little gap I've left in here because I'm going to add something else in. Something that Agile doesn't traditionally do is provide anything like a Gantt chart. So if people are used to seeing Gantt charts, and a Gantt chart, for those that don't know, is one of these things that looks something like this. You might have dependencies like this, tasks or work packages. And the wonderful thing about a Gantt chart is we get to see the shape of a project over time. So when are these things going to get done? Now, Gantt charts are central to waterfall development and any waterfall project. What you'll find is that Agile proponents, I've often found they think that Gantt charts have no place in Agile. In fact, they think that Gantt charts are heresy. But I don't agree, and that's actually reflected in the latest release of Jira, which includes a feature called Jira Roadmaps. And Jira Roadmaps allows us to have this extra view, which I'm going to write down here. So there are really 3 key views that I'm going to show you in Jira. They are roadmap, backlog, and board. And by illustrating here, I'm hoping I'm going to start to reinforce these concepts in your mind. So what does the roadmap look like? Well, let's describe the roadmap as follows. So remember all these items that we got on our backlog, lots of discrete individual items. Now, to anybody that's working in Jira and in development and in this project, whether it's software or whether it's Jira, whether it's Agile in an HR project or Agile in a finance project, whatever the project, if we have lots of discrete stories, those that are working within this tool, within the project every day, they'll know immediately what these stories are. In fact, they'll even start to remember that the ID, the keys, so RA323 is, this one. They'll remember these things. But to other observers and stakeholders, this list just becomes very difficult to comprehend, to try to divine the meaning from it. So I've got, let's say, 60 items in my current sprint. But what are they all contributing towards? Well, that's where now we'll introduce another concept, which we'll call epics. So let's draw a couple of things here. I'm going to write down here stories. I'm going to write subtasks. And up here, I'm going to write epics. So what epics are, lots of definitions of epics, but most people center on the idea that an epic is like a big story that you won't get completed in one sprint. So the hierarchy of these things is something like this. Well, it's exactly like this. It's exactly like this. In fact, epics will contain multiple stories, and stories can contain multiple subtasks. But let's talk about epics. I was saying that you look at all these items on the list, and it's sometimes hard to divine what the meaning is. Epics are a way of, at least the way we use them in Telmar, grouping these stories. So we might have, in fact, the way we do it in Telmar is we will relate epics to products or projects. So we'll have an epic for survey time. We'll have an epic for media time. But we also might have an epic for, let's say, a project, let's say Adlock Switzerland. The great thing about using epics in this way is epics allow us to assign these stories down here, there we go, way down here, to epics. So that means that, let's color code these. These first two stories might belong to a survey time epic. These next two stories might belong to a media time epic. This story and this one might be Adlock, and this one might be media time, and this one might be survey time. So look at this. What does it give you? It gives you an at-a-glance view that if we're looking at the current sprint, we can easily see. Let's carry the colors through here. What did we say? I think we did something like this. So what we can do, we can easily see that when we're looking at this backlog, remember I told you one of these key views was the backlog, we can get an at-a-glance view to see that in this current sprint, we're spending some time on survey time and we're spending some time on media time. And in the backlog, we've got some stuff coming up for Adlock, but we're not currently working on it. So I always think that when you're looking at the sprint backlog tells you what's in the current sprint. And that's obviously useful, but what's in the backlog is also useful because it's showing the stakeholders, look, we know, we understand, and we're aware of your requirement. Here it is down here, but it's not yet in the current sprint. And it's not in the current sprint because right now we're working on all this other stuff. So Agile is a really good way to communicate with stakeholders, Agile and the board and the backlog, because not only can we show you what we're working on, but we can show you what we're not working on. And that allows a stakeholder to question, well, why are you not working on this? This is my most important project. With the board, with the sprint backlog and the product backlog, we can illustrate that as far as our capacity goes for development, right now, all our capacity is on, say, survey time and media time. And that's why, Mr. Stakeholder, your Adlock is not in there. Now it's great because now we can have a conversation about prioritization. And if we need to, we can adjust the prioritization. We can rebalance the priorities for the next short sprint. Okay, so we are going to, a backlog view. The backlog view in Jira, I will just show you, but effectively it lets us see a Gantt chart that it might show us survey time work, progressing for maybe 3 months here. It might show us, let's imagine that this is where we are today. It might show us Adlock work, maybe not starting yet, going over here. It might show us media time work in progress now and running on. So you'll see when we look at Jira, you'll see this view. I'll talk about subtasks as well. So let's undo some of these scribbles. Yep, okay. So we've talked about epics, the idea that epics contain stories. When we plan a sprint, we're working with stories. When we're working in the board, we're working with stories, but stories aren't granular enough for work to happen. So what happens is when we plan stories into the backlog, remember we started with them all here in the to-do column, right up here. We plan the stories in. We also, so this is like a card on a board. I said this is, imagine literally a board on the wall. These could be post-it notes on the wall. Each story gets broken down into a number of subtasks. And actually the way we move these through the board is we pick up the subtasks and we work on the subtasks. And when the subtasks are done, then the story becomes done. So that's the granularity. The subtasks roll up subtasks. When they're all done, the story is done. When all the stories are done, the epic is done. Right, I think that's enough theory. Let's just link in Confluence to this. So where's Confluence feature in all this? Jira is about product management. It's also about project management. It's about development management. It's true that in stories and subtasks, they will contain notes, they'll contain information, they'll contain comments, but they're not persistent documentation. So Jira is about the work that's in progress, but it's transient. Once the work is done, it's gone. Confluence, on the other hand, let's call it knowledge management. It's a wiki, so it's a series of, just like a series of web pages, hyperlink web pages, and Confluence is where we really do the documentation. So if there's a story in the backlog, let's point to, say, this one up here. We can contain a certain amount of information on that story in the Jira ticket, in the story, literally in Jira. But once that story is done, that information is not easily accessible. It's transient. It's passed us by. So we use Confluence to document. So I always think of Confluence as, Confluence is the persistent knowledge management, knowledge capture. So we might have a story, let's say this story up here might be called RA123, but we can link this story to a page in Confluence, or even a series of pages in Confluence which contains more information. So that's why I say that Confluence and Jira are tightly related. Okay, let's move on a pace and let's take a look at the tools themselves. So where do we start? Let's start with Jira, since we were talking about these all these views. So let's flip over here. How do I lose this? Let's try and get this off the screen. There we go. Right. So this is Jira, and remember over here I talked about roadmap, backlog, and board. Let's use another. Let's go to another space here. We need to go to this platform, Telmar Unified Platform. Okay, so here we are, roadmap, backlog, and board. And you'll see how these things exactly relate to what I've been talking about on the sketches here. So where do we, how do we dip into here? I think let's start with backlog. So yeah, let's start here. Now I talked about also this hierarchy between epics and stories and subtasks. That's really important to remember. There's a sort of parallel between this hierarchy and these views. And the reason I say that is because roadmap tends to deal with, it's an epic centric view. So these are epics, Telmar Audio US MVP. So we can do a couple of things here. Let's leave it as quarters. So you see, I explained this, that you've got this idea of a Gantt chart. So we can see this work is in progress. We can see that this work is about to start. We can see that this one's programmed a little further out. So this gives a very, very high level horizon view, if you like, particularly useful for senior stakeholders to know what's going on. Not so useful for engineers working on the actual work, and moderately useful for planning. So roadmap is epic centric, great for high level, long range planning visibility. You can incidentally drill down, but it is an epic centric view where you can just dip down to the next level of detail. These are stories, but not subtasks. Backlog starts to go down another level. So backlog is, as I mentioned, remember it's this big list. It's this big list here. So you see, this is Telmar Unified Platform Sprint 9. There are 33 issues in it. We've got a time scale on it. And if I just collapse that list, what you'll see below is everything else. So this is actually the product backlog. Now we're giving it a name. It's called TU Sprint 10 because you can actually name it anything you like. This is the next sprint in formation. But if you look at the whole list together, what you're seeing in the backlog view is all the stuff at the top of the list is effectively this stuff above the line. This is the stuff we've planned to do in the current sprint, and it's in the current sprint. And everything else below this line is the rest of the backlog. So this is how this concept exactly matches to Jira. So with this view, I can see everything that's in current development cycle. It does this little thing, it crosses them out when they're done. And this tells me the epic that it belongs to. So epic's useful here because at a glance, I can see that these two, we're spending some time in this sprint on Adlock Eurosport, probably that is, Adlock Eurosport. Let's have a look, we'll just click on this story, get this preview window. Yep, so this is Adlock Eurosport, Adlock Eurosport, Adlock Eurosport, Ethno-I, Distributed Algorithms, POC, Telmar Audio, Adlock Eurosport. So this is the at-a-glance view of what we're working on in the current sprint. Then let's go down to the board. And the board is really where we spend our time in the day doing the work. So if we do a couple of things here, let's collapse all these. Now, what you're really seeing here is, let's just make a bit more space. So you see 3 columns: to do, in progress, and done. So this board, Tell Me Unified Platform board, is kept very simple. And this is a story and a story and a story. Now, because these are broken down into subtasks, as I showed you over here, we don't move entire stories through the process. We just move the subtasks through the process. So if you look at this one here, this story has 1 subtask, and actually it's done. So that would mean that the story should be done. If we look at this story, we can see it's got 1 subtask, which is done in this column, and another subtask, which is to do. And the principle is exactly like this. You move them through. In fact, the engineer would move it in this case, or the person doing the work. And the same all the way down here. You see this story has 2 subtasks still to do. Let's go to another project. So we have the Telmar Unified Platform board where all new projects are going, and that is configured to show these 3 views: roadmap at the top level, backlog, and the daily board. Our other project, which is Telmar Legacy Software, is on old style Jira, and it only has backlog and the board. So no roadmap view here. As I said, the roadmap view was an innovation introduced by Jira with Jira NextGen. So the backlog here works exactly the same way. We've got the current sprint. If I just collapse that, we see the next sprint in formation. And if I collapse that, and then you see there's the whole backlog. So it is just this one big log list with these, if you like, lines drawn across to note what we're working on. A couple of neat things that you can use in here. There are epics filters. If I want to know what's everything we're doing at the moment on survey time, I can go down this list. Let's do this again. I can pop out the epics panel here. Let's just lose the sidebar. And I can scroll down this list, which is all the IT stuff first: systems, data, algorithms, products. So let's go down product, and this is all alphabetical: channel planner, checkup, cluster. So we're looking for survey time. So if I click on this, this is now filtering the list. It's filtering in fact, it's filtering the entire backlog. So it's filtering the sprint backlog and the product backlog by this epic. So I can see that in the current sprint, we've got 9 issues or stories, bugs, story discoveries, collectively just issues, or generically just issues. 9 of those out of 67 are related to survey time, but we can also look at the backlog. So we've got nothing scheduled for the next sprint as yet, but some of these things might move up. And in the backlog, there's a whole ton of stuff that we know about, but which at the moment isn't priority. So we can, let's clear that filter, all issues. So that's a pretty neat feature. And again, as you can see, we could look at the TLS sprint, 67 issues, and see broadly where we're spending our time: survey time, GTV, transmit new, cluster, correspondence. So this is how we get that view. We can, if you like, check that what we're working on is aligned with the corporate priorities, which is largely at the moment stretch 2020 goals. Right, pause for breath. Let's go back to the agenda that we have here and see how we're doing. So we're talking about Jira. So yeah, projects. I mentioned there are 2 projects at the moment. We've got TLS, which is all the legacy. All the new projects are going into Telmar Unified Platform with that roadmap view. We've also got the global data loading board. It's all the data loading is now also in an agile flow. And we also have the I squared board. So these are predominantly the main 4 boards. And then as we know, we've got Victoria's working in Agile HR. So we can go and have a look at her board. Haven't looked at this for a while. Let's see how she's getting on. So you can see, here we go. This is great. Let's look at a fresh board, try and divine some meaning from it. Let's see how Agile really is working then. As a stakeholder, I'm interested to see what HR is working on. So we can see that HR has in their first sprint, which ends on 26th of May, so 5 days time, we can see they've got 14 issues, of which the first 5 or 6 are done, and the remainder are here. They're organized by epic. So some works are concerning town hall, some are concerning employee relations, some are concerning bamboo. I mean, this is just amazing to be able to see this. In fact, it's quite interesting for me to look at the HR board because I'm not involved in this project. So it's a useful test to see whether Jira is helpful for me to be able to get a sense of what's going on. So here's the backlog. I could look at the board. And again, I can see, so Victoria's working with entire stories. It doesn't look like she's breaking down into subtasks. So you don't have those swim lanes view. And this suits the level of granularity that she wants to work to. So this is great. We can see in the current sprint, we've got all these stories done. We've got these few in progress. We can see some are assigned to Victoria, some are assigned to Seashore. This little number here is these are called story points. This is a measure of size or level of effort. So we can see this is a very small item, a couple of hours. 8, I think, is 3 to 5 days. There's a key that we use for story points. And this is significantly larger. And so this is great. So very good. So in all this we've talked about projects, general orientation. I think you sort of pick up as we go through. We've looked at roadmap, backlog, and active sprint. The key issue types, well, okay, let's go back to TLS because we've got all 3 issue types in there. The key issue types, every item in Jira is generically known as an issue, whether it's back here. Here we go. Whether it's an epic or a story or a subtask, they're all called issues. And stories can have multiple types. So we've chosen to create multiple types of stories. So when I say we want to look at the main issue types, I'll tell you what they are. We've got, let's hover over these. Right, looking at the current sprint, in the current sprint, we've got some what are called discoveries. So this little orange exclamation mark is a discovery. It's a piece of research or research or learning work. We've got bugs, which I think are self-explanatory. And we've got what we just call stories. So a story might be a new feature or it might be a change request. You know, we could break that down further if we were interested to see what are new features and what are change requests. But again, keeping it as simple as possible right now. So we have 3 different types of stories. We have epics that sit above stories, and we have subtasks that sit below. Reports and filters and comments. Right, let's quickly show you reports. So let's go, in fact, I'm interested now to go to the HR board. One of the most used reports is called the Sprint Burn Down. The Sprint Burn Down does the following. Interesting. Right. So Sprint Burn Down, this is time. So this would be the first day of our sprint and the last day of our sprint. And this gray line starts from, I talked about story points, this level of effort. Every story is estimated with a story points number. And when we start the sprint, in this case, Jira has said, well, in this sprint, you started with 60 points. You've got 2 weeks to burn down. So your ideal burn down is going to look like this. And this chart, the burn down, it tracks how we're doing. Now, a perfect sprint is probably going to go something like this. Horizontal for a while subtasks get done. And when all the subtasks on the story get done, the story will burn down. The story will get done. And it will just go like this. I mean, that's an ideal world. Almost never does it work like that. especially in an organization of our size where you've got so many developers, so many interests. It's an enterprise class sale, so we have a few very large, powerful customers that sometimes will disrupt our sprint because we've got to drop everything and go to a bug. But what we're seeing here is we got something was done here, and then we've got an issue was added to the sprint, an estimate was updated, and another estimate was updated. So we know that this is now the current level, and what we've got here at this point, so around about 18th or 19th of May, another issue, or it looks like we probably burned down here, an item was done, then something was added, something was done, something was done, something was moved back to not done, something was done. So this is the burn down, and this is not so much useful for execs, but very useful for product managers, project managers. In this case, Victoria, the department head, because she can see how work is progressing. This is not necessarily bad. It's just telling us that maybe our planning wasn't so accurate. One of the principles of Agile is that you get better at planning over successive sprints because you get to understand what is your capacity. You get better at estimating stories in the first place so that you get fewer situations where an estimate is updated. But also you get better at scoping out how much work you can do at the start. And so generally we're aiming for a burn down that comes close to this. That's really the main report. Filters, let's show you very briefly filters because it's really getting into advanced features. So filters allow us to effectively make custom views of the board. So I can go to filters here and I can basically query. I can say, show me stories that are in the TLS sprint. Show me just the bugs that are in progress, testing, or to do, assigned to anybody, and let's say in the current sprint. So we're going to, sorry, not there. Sprint. Let's say, what is the current sprint? I don't know what the current sprint is, but let's say, for example, sprint 28. So this is showing me that 2 bugs on this board were in progress or to done and were in sprint 28, and I can go and inspect them. I can see who they were assigned to, what the size of them was, and what epic they belong to. But the filters are very powerful. I mean, filter would let you do things like show me all the stories that aren't assigned to an epic, so that we can fix them and get them assigned to the correct epic. Or we could say, show me all the stories that have no story points, i.e. they haven't been estimated. So that's Jira. That gives me about 10 minutes to go through everything in Confluence. So this is going to be an interesting challenge. No, in fact, what we'll do, we will do a second video just on Confluence. So I'm going to end this video here, and the next video will be just Confluence. So let's use the time instead to wrap up on Jira. So what we covered here, we started with an agenda that looked like this. I want to tell you about Jira and I want to tell you about Confluence. But as I said, I can't really escape talking about these two until I explain a little bit about Agile. So we did this whole thing here, talking about some of the key principles of Agile. And you can see the reason I do that is I can show you Jira and I can show you what things do, but you need to be able to place those into context to get meaning from them. So the key things to highlight in Jira and in Agile would be the following. Let's do this. Let's go for a little highlighter here. Right. The key things would be, there is this thing that is called the backlog. It's the list of stuff we want to work on. And there's a corresponding view in Jira called backlog down here. There is the idea that we prioritize the backlog, and then we determine that in the next sprint, we will plan to do just this work, and we will consciously not focus on the other stuff. In fact, while the development's going on, it's product managers and product owners that will be starting to flesh and form and groom. That's another term, is backlog grooming the backlog to reprioritize and make sure that we're elaborating and making sure these next bunch of priorities are sufficiently comprehensive to be able to move into the next sprint and be worked on. So backlog, sprint backlog. We move the sprint backlog to the board. So if you like, this is our planning. This is our day-to-day doing, right? So planning, day-to-day doing, planning, doing. And in the backlog, we have to do, in progress, and done. And stories get broken down into subtasks, and subtasks get moved through the workflow. And when all the subtasks for a story are done, the story becomes done. There's the burn down report, which gives us some visibility. Well, let's just flip back here. As I said, the backlog has a corresponding view in Jira called backlog. The board has a corresponding view in Jira called the board, or actually, I think it's called active sprints, active sprint in the menu. Let's have a look. Let's go back to the project. Active sprint. In fact, look at the icon tells you, right? Backlog, a list of stuff. Board, swim lanes that we move things through. So corresponding view is the board, has a corresponding view down here. And then we sort of elevated back up and we said, well, that's interesting to see a list view of all the work, but it doesn't give us a time dimension. So there's another level of abstraction above, which concerns epics, and the idea that we can have a Gantt chart that shows where we are with epics, and there's a corresponding view in Jira, and that's called roadmap. That's only in Jira Next Gen, new Jira. Well, I think that's it for your Agile whirlwind tour and your Jira whirlwind tour. And the next video will be Confluence. Thank you for watching.